Thank you for joining us today. Due to the COVID-19 crisis, we canceled the in-person conference. This recorded session replaces the in-person conference planned for June 23rd in Philadelphia. Your presenters today are Marianne Gibbs from EBSA, Yago Zhang from IRS, Pat Fobert, Aaron Sherwood, Bill DeVore, and Jeff Goldhirsch, all from GDIT. Our plan today is we'll do an overview of the software developer certification process and provide key dates. Then we'll discuss the 2020 data element requirements, specifically changes to existing forms and schedules, and the addition of the Form 5500 EZ. Then we'll do a little wrap up for you. Marianne, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Pat. I would like to provide a very brief background on the Form 5500 series for folks that are new to the program and define some key terms. The forms are developed and sponsored by 3 government agencies: the Department of Labor's Employee Benefit Security Administration, the IRS, and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. Form 5500 series filings are generally required to be submitted annually by employers and administrators of employee benefit plans. These filings are required by ERISA. ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and by IRS code. The purpose of the filing is to report information describing the plan, its financial condition and investments, and operations. The Form 5500 series includes the Form 5500, the Form 5500 SF, which stands for short form, schedules and attachments. And new to EFAST this year, it will also include the Form 5500 EZ. The development process we go through to create the new form for filing each year is what we call rollover. Nearly 1 million plan filings are submitted each year. Only about 10% of those are submitted through the EFAST2 website. And the EFAST2 website is at www.efast.dol.gov. And note that we're updating the look and feel of that website. So if it looks a little different lately, it functions the same. And the application on our website that can be used by filers to prepare and submit filings directly to the government is called iFile. The vast majority of Form 5500s then are prepared and submitted using third-party software. Since third-party software developers are a key element of collecting the Form 5500, the EFAST team provides a briefing each year explaining preparation and transmission processes and details changes since the previous year. And Aaron will now explain the steps to be an approved software provider for the Form 5500 series.
Thank you, Marianne. All right, so we'll start here today with an overview of the EFAST2 testing and certification process. This is a process to become certified to prepare and electronically submit Form 5500 series filings to EFAST2. And the processing for testing and certifying software is called the Participant Acceptance Testing System. We'll use PATS through the rest of this presentation. For new software companies, we would need to have a transmission software tested prior to beginning the filing preparation software testing. Here's kind of an overview of the basic steps. First, you would log in to the EFAST website and access materials that you'll use that you will use to develop your software. After accessing the materials, you would register the company if you're a new company or the product to obtain software IDs. Next, you would submit the test cases to the EFAST2 endpoints. Once you've submitted the test cases that you would like to have reviewed, email a list of the request IDs to the contact center with indication of the cases are ready for review, and we will review those. And then finally, after the PATS test case submissions are reviewed and approved, you would sign your online or manual PDF affidavit. The affidavit text is in section 4.2 of the software developer specification if you're interested. The software developer material is all available at the EFAST2 website. Marianne referred to that earlier, and it will look a little different when you visit it next. You must be registered as an EFAST2 user to be able to access the third-party software developer materials. The navigation menu will be will include software developer tools link if you have the third-party software developer user type. We're going to go through what some of those materials are here, again, in sort of a high level, but these are the materials that you would be accessing to begin and use during testing. First is the PATS package. The PATS package contains a lot of materials that are all unique to the form version. You can see here that there are the 4 current form versions there. And within the PATS package, you'll find folders and other files for the instructions, the test filings, things like the software developer specification. Here you can see the PATS package itself contains test cases as a file of some test case attachments, test cases for transmission testing, and also a document to describe those files. For the instructions, you can see that we provide the draft versions and a red line strikeout and clean versions of the upcoming rollover instructions. Those are provided as a courtesy to help through development. They're not for release to the public. Finally, with the PATS package, the software developer specification contains quite a bit of information related to registration of products, the certification process, file structures, utility services, a list of the DER changes for the year, and also EFAST2 error messages are documented here. Next, we talk about the data elements requirement. This is commonly referred to as the DER, and there are PDF version of the DER and also XML version for each form version. The DER is what is used to document the variable numbers we'll be talking about later in the rollover changes, as well as the schema info and type, and all of the edit tests are also documented in the DER. Next, we have schema files. The schema files are available for each form version. As you can see here, the XML schema definition files and also the WSDL files are included in this download. And then there's also a utility a schema file. This has to do with the web services that are not form year specific, such as signature validation and attachment validation. And then we have edit test mask lists. This is one single download file that has the current, most up-to-date mask lists, and edit test mask lists are used to document the edit tests that are currently not active in the EFAST2 system. So if they're masked, they're not active, and this is the list for that. Okay, so next we have a slide that shows registration where you can add a company if you're a new company, or if you're an existing company, you would just add product there. For adding product, you would need to have one active transmission software ID that has already become certified, but additional certification of the transmission ID is not required. Filing preparation software, however, is required to be certified for each form version as the forms change. So here is where you would add the product to obtain a software ID. For 2020, the form changes included some new checkboxes and lines on the Schedule H and Schedule R. We'll be talking about those in more detail in the later slides when we talk about rollover changes. Those changes have been incorporated into the existing PATS test case number 2. The 2020 PATS test cases also include a new test case number 7 for the 5500 EZ. Again, we'll be talking about the EZ more later in the presentation. All right, each year with the PATS release in August, certain edit tests are masked to prevent the unintended signature warnings to occur during PATS testing. These edit tests are active in production as of January 1st, but here is a list of the ones that are masked from August when we released to PATS system to January 1st, which is when the rollover changes are made in production. Just a reminder, We have an exception process for software that is unable to produce a certain portion of the test case. We also have limited approval process for software that does not support each available form and schedule. The request for those exceptions or limited approval must be emailed to the contact center annually. And just to note here, we'll talk about it again, but the contact center email address was recently changed to support@efast.dol.gov. The old email addresses will still forward to this new email address for the time. And also a reminder, if you obtain software certification for the upcoming plan year, you cannot use the certified software IDs in production until January 1st. So finally, EFAST2 maintains an email distribution list to send notifications to third-party software developers and service providers. Please email us to request adding or removing contacts or to verify the recipients from your company. This EFAST2 list is used to let you know of maintenance that we schedule for outside of business hours, and we also schedule that to avoid peak filing dates. We send out the notifications as much in advance as possible. Okay, important dates for 2020 rollover. Key dates include August the 5th will be the PATS release for the 2020 form version. With this release, the previous form versions will become inactive. For the first time this year, only 2 active form versions will remain, the current form and the new form version. So with the August PATS release, we will inactivate the 2016, 2017, and 2018 form versions, leaving the 2019 form active as well as the new 2020 form version. Another key date is December 31st. It's the last date that short plan year filers can submit a 2020 plan year filing on a 2019 form. As of January 1st, the 2020 plan year filing must be submitted on the 2020 form. And then with the production release of the 2020 form on January 1st, the 2016, 17, and 18 forms will be inactivated in production. At this time, I'll turn things over to Mary Ann. She will introduce the 2020 rollover changes.
Thank you, Aaron. Now we're going to walk through all the 2020 forms and rollover changes that will be effective January 1st, 2021. We're starting with the premise that you're already familiar with the 2019 Form 5500 series filing requirements. Now for the 2020 Form 5500 series, the big change is the addition of the Form 5500 EZ into EFAST. The 5500 EZ is filed by one participant plans and farm plans. Before this, the EZ had to be submitted on paper to the IRS, or information could be reported by answering a subset of questions on the Form 5500 SF. So with this, we have to make a related change on the 5500 SF and an edit test on that form, since one participant and farm plans can no longer use that form. We're also making a handful of changes on schedules H and R and adding a few new edit tests, not including edit tests specific to the EZ. Those will be discussed later. Finally, we're making a change in the actuary enrollment code so that actuaries can use their newly issued enrollment numbers. On the next slide, as Aaron explained, material for 2020 rollover, including draft forms and instructions, are being posted on the EFAST2 website for third-party software developers access. If you dig into those files, you'll see a file for the 5500 SF that shows track changes between the 2019 and 2020 versions. I encourage you to take a look at that so you see how the filing requirements have changed for the SF, since the one participant and farm plan filers now need to file the EZ. And this slide shows a small extract of those instruction changes. But again, I encourage you to review the actual instructions. On the next slide, we're illustrating how the Form 5500 SF, the form itself, has been changed to remove the checkboxes for one participant plans and farm plans. And Aaron will now walk you through the corresponding adjustments to the affected data element requirements in support of this forms change.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. All right, so related to the 5500 SF changes, the dir variable for line A was updated to remove valid values 3 and 4, as we described in the previous slide there. Also, edit test P394SF is no longer applicable and has been deleted. Next, the pension benefit code 3E, which was used by one participant plans, is no longer valid for the short form. So the specification and XPath for this edit test were modified. On the Form 5500, a new edit test I206 was added to identify a plan that checked multi-employer plan on line A and used plan characteristic code 3D on line 8A. Multi-employer plans are always considered individually designed plans and cannot use code 3D as a pre-approved plan. Schedule R, line 14A, includes checkboxes for 3 counting methods, and lines 14B and 14C include checkboxes for when the number reported is a change from what was previously reported. The form includes a reference to see instructions for required attachment, which we will see on the next slides. So here are the new dir variables for lines 14A, B, and C, including valid values for line 14A. The dir variables for the count fields on lines 14A, B, and C were also updated, but only to include a new comment. That comment says that values must be entered into the fields and cannot default to 0. So those are existing dir variables with newly added comments. The Schedule R inactive participant info is a new attachment type for the Schedule R lines 14A, B, and C. The 5500 instructions for Schedule R includes information related to this attachment. And we'll see the new attachment type here in just a slide or two. All right, several new edit tests are added related to the Schedule R lines 14A, B, and C. We have B738 checks if line 14A is blank. B739, 741, and 743 all check for the attachment if the corresponding lines 14A, B, or C are checked. We have a couple of edit tests, number B740 and B742, that check for counts less than 0 or blank. And B744 is similar, checks for line A that's blank or less than 0 or greater than certain calculations from the 5500 and the Schedule MB when a multi-employer plan is checked and a defined benefit code is present. So there's a lot there. You can take a look at those in the dir or in the presentation. Schedule H, line 3B, contains 3 new checkboxes. These replace a previous single checkbox. The checkboxes are to indicate whether the IQPA performed an ERISA Section 103A3 audit. Here we see the new dir variables for line 3B checkboxes. Also, the previous single checkbox variable was deleted, and the related edit tests, P292 and P293, they were not updated for this form version. They will be masked for the 2020 form year and will possibly be updated for the 2021 form. These are 2 edits that previously were related to the single checkbox, and now, once they're updated, would be related to the newly added 3 checkboxes. The Schedule H instructions and the Form 5500 instructions section changes to note both refer to the changes to Schedule H line 3B. You can review the draft instructions that Marianne alluded to earlier to find all of the changes to note and all of the added information for the changes to lines to Schedule H and Schedule R. For existing edit test Schedule HP409, the acknowledgement error message was updated to remove the reference to line 3A, which was not in the specification of this edit test. So this is just a correction to remove something from the error message that was not related to the specification. Another change that's kind of separate from everything else, but Marianne mentioned this earlier, is the change for the schedules MB and SB. The enrollment code prefix 20 is added to the existing codes 14 and 17. The 14 code remains valid for amended filings with no changes to actuarial information. This change applies to both the 2019 and 2020 forms and affects edit test I-124MB and I-124SB. And of course, once this change is made for the 2019 and 2020 DERs, those two edit tests which are currently masked in production will not be masked. Existing edit test B701SB, this edit test was updated to correct XPath in the PDF DIR to match the XPath in the XML DIR. So the edit test was performing as expected. This is a documentation change in the PDF DIR to update the XPath information. And edit test B671, another existing edit test. This was updated to remove a few bypass codes that had been part of the edit test, meaning the error will no longer be bypassed for those situations. And the codes were for welfare plans, fully insured welfare plans, and target benefit money purchase and offset plans. Those are the three bypass codes that are being removed. Okay, with that, I'll transfer things over to Yago to begin our discussion for the Form 5500 EZ.
Okay, thank you. Now I will present Form 5500 EZ because this is the first year that Form 5500 EZ is processing through the EFAST2 system. So we all know that the prior to the 2020 Form 5500 EZ file, including like the one participant plan or certain foreign plans, they can file electronically using the Form 5500 SF. But starting this year, 2020, Form 5500 SF is no longer used for EZ file. So that's why I will very briefly to discuss the Form 5500 EZ, including like who must file, how to file, and how to file amended returns. So who must file the Form 5500 EZ? We all know that the Form 5500 and the 5500 SF are used to file for the employee benefit plan that are required under the ERISA and the Internal Revenue Code. But the Form 5500 EZ is designated for retirement plans only subject to the Internal Revenue Code, that is 6058A, not subject to ERISA Title I. So you can call that the 5500 EZ, the plan, you can call this no Title I plan. That's the 5500 EZ just used for one participant plan and the foreign plan. One participant plan doesn't necessarily mean that it just only have one participant. So it just means this is a retirement plan. You can be defined benefit plan or defined contribution plan or 401k plan, whatever. So other than ESOP plan, so ESOP plan cannot be there. So that plan, you only cover business owner or spouse who they own the entire business, or only cover the partner and the partner spouse. So that's the plan only benefit this owner spouse, cannot benefit to anyone else. Okay, so the foreign plan, that means the retirement plan maintained outside the United States, primarily for no residence area. So not all plans are required to file Form 5500EZ. So only for certain plans. So that these plans, what? Their plan sponsor should be either domestic employer or foreign employer. They have income delivered from the source within the United States. So also their contribution to the plan are deducted in the U.S. income tax return. So we just tell you who must file. At this point, just for one principal plan and a foreign plan. So before 2009, it's only for one principal plan. The foreign plan just added, started 2019. How to file the Form 5500EZ? So 5500EZ started this year, 2020. You can file on paper, mailed to the IRS, okay? Or you can file electronically through the EFAST2. So that's why we're talking today. But just be aware of that. The IRS has the mandatory e-filing requirement. So that's everybody knows that 5500 and 5500 SF are required to file electronically, right? No paper option. But the 5500EZ have the paper option just because we have different the e-filing requirement with the IRS. So IRS regulation require you to file electronically. So if you have to file at least 250 returns with the IRS, so then you must file it electronically. But just remember that the Taxpayer First Act changed that 250, that number, down to 10, start 2021. Okay, so which means if you are required to file more than 10 any kind of the returns to IRS, then you have to mandatory file 5500EZ through EFAST2. So if you don't do that, you just file the paper instead, you are required to file electronically, you will be treated as the no file. So just for the how to file, you can paper filing, you can the e-filing. Even if you are not subject to mandatory the e-filing, you still can file electronically through the EFAST2 system. So next slide for the EFAST2 filing system. So I will not discuss that for EFAST2. So we already discussed it a lot. Yeah. So I only would like to mention that because a lot of the files, they have the disclosure concern because they just think if the one particular plan filed electronically, they probably will be disclosed their information on the DOL website. So I will repeat here that information filed on 5500EZ, regardless this is a paper or electronically, that is required to be made available to the public. But this is based on the IRS procedure. So any information you filed through EFAST2 will not published on the internet. Regardless, this is the filed paper or filed electronically will not post on the web page. Yeah. So another slide I will discuss for the amended returns, because previously we instruct the file. If you filed 5500 SF previously, okay, then your amended the return, you can submit either electronically using the 5500 SF or on paper. Yeah, if you previously filed on paper, then you must submit the amended return using the paper. This is the previous instruction. So only change we listed here because just to be consistent for e-filing and for the processing. Also, 5500 easy, it's just back to the EFAST2 system. So the only change here, we just require that if you previously filed electronically, then your amended return also must file electronically. No paper filing option. So which means if you filed for the before 2019, before 2020, you filed 5500 SF electronically instead of the 5500 easy. So you amended the return must be filed electronically using 5500 SF for plan year before 2020. But starting 2020, if you filed 5500 easy electronically, then if you have amended returns, you also have to file electronically using Form 5500 easy. So if you file the paper, then you should be continue using the paper form. Okay, so this is the for the what I briefly discussed for the 5500 easy. But at this point, I will also like to mention on the slide 44 that regarding the late file penalty relief program. Because in the paper form, we have the checkbox. We have checkbox to tell them if this return is for the IRS late file penalty relief program, check this box. So just to be aware that if you filing electronically 5500 easy, please do not check that box. Just because IRS established the permanent late file penalty relief program for no Title I plan that was starting June 3rd, 2015. So we have the revenue procedure 2015-32. So that the revenue procedure just require all the applicants must submit the application for relief using the paper filing. So that checkbox is still listed on the Form 5500 Easy line Part 1D. That is for use of paper filing only, not for e-filing. So at this point, we continue the process based on 2015-32. Yeah, probably later on, we will allow them to do that because once we reprogramming in our system, pay.gov, and update our guidance, but this is the probably the later year, not today. So this is all I have today. Now, I just turn over to Jeff.
All right, thank you, Iago, for walking us through the first part of the 5500 Easy presentation. So what I'm actually going to talk through are the new data elements that we're adding in support of the 5500 Easy, as well as their matching edits. And Bill is also going to walk through some of those as well. So we're going to kind of tag team split this up. So there are 32 new edits and then about 12 updates to the entity edits that we're going to cover. While 32 edits might sound like a lot, all but 2 of them have a matching short form or regular 5500 edit that is basically the same edit with just the XPath changes to accommodate the location in the easy form. So the first, we're going to start with part 1. And so this has the plan your begin date and plan your end date. And this is just the P209EZ is a check to make sure that that it's not more than 12 months between the plan your begin date and plan your end date. Moving to the next slide here. So also part of part 1 are the standard initial filing indicator, amended indicator, final filing indicator, and short plan your indicator. These are all of checkbox type, which is a type that was defined, that was already defined. So we're reusing. You'll notice that I think all of these types that were in the EZ are all reusing of existing types we have. I don't believe there might be 1 or 2 new XML types we had to create, but nothing's coming to mind. So related to those fields, there are 2 edits, P397EZ, which is if the final return isn't checked, but the total participants and equals 0, and then this edit fires. And then finally, X034EZ is if the short form is checked, but the plan year end date minus the plan year begin date is not less than 12 months. So if it's a full year filing and you accidentally checked this checkbox, then this edit will fire. And then these are the EXT extended indicator, the easy form plan indicator, and then the late filer penalty relief program. These are 3 checkboxes. This edit is one that we already talked about, which is that you cannot file electronically if you are filing under the late filer penalty relief program. These are 3. We're now moving on to part 2 of the basic plan information, and so this is capturing the plan name, the sponsor plan num, and the plan effective date. And then there's some associated edits here. So J503EZ says that if it's a defined benefit plan, that the plan num has to be greater than 500. P219EZ says the plan effective date cannot be blank, and then X004EZ says is an edit to make sure that the plan effective date is valid for this plan year, this form year. Moving on to more basic plan information in part 2, we have the employer's name, the employer doing business as, and the employer's care of name. And then the edit that's related to this section, it's actually on the next one, is X113EZ, which is that the employer mailing address cannot be blank. And then we describe the employer address here. It's either a US address or a foreign address, and this address type is consistent with the address types that we had on the 5500 and 5500 short form. And so this is additional information about the EIN, the employer plan number, the employer telephone number, and then the business classification code. And then there are a couple of edits related to this. So B736EZ, there are a couple of business codes that there's a warning edit associated with where it fires if you're using codes that I think are commonly confused with the actual business code that people are using. And then there's a J502EZ is saying that line 2D which is the EIN, cannot be missing or it's an invalid format. Continuing on in the part 2, we have the administrator's name and the administrator's care of name. And then there's also the option to use the same if the administrator and the employer are the same. So there's also the same option to use same. And then again, we have the address, foreign US address or foreign address. Again, this is the same structure we had before. So I-159EZ is a edit that says that line 2B, if we go back, 2B is actually on, 2B is the EIN. Cannot begin with these numbers, so that is the EIN is starting with some invalid numbers that are not valid for EINs. And then we have the administrator EIN, the administrator phone number, and the administrator foreign phone number. And then these next fields under the plan basic information are used if we've had if an employee if a employer has changed the name or the EIN or the plan name or the plan number from the last report, and this is where you would report the previous versions of those values. This will be useful to help prevent entity edits down the line. And then, so these are some of the data, numerical data elements. So this is where we're going to capture the total participants, the active participants, the participants that terminated employment with accrued pension benefits. And so again, these are using the count 8 type, which is a data type that we already had. And then these are some edits here that are related to those. So you have to report P356EZ, you have to report the number of participants that were there at the beginning of the season, and then there's associated edits such that the number of participants can't be less than the number of active participants, and so that would be on comparing 5A1 to 5A2, and then the same going for the number of participants entered on 5B. 5B1 cannot be less than the number of active participants on 5B2. So that's comparing the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And then for these, the next, for the financial information in part 3, we're looking at the beginning of year amounts of total assets, total liabilities, and net assets. And then the same for total liabilities as well. And then there's several edits in here that are here to, 2 edits in here that are here to check the arithmetic to make sure that the net assets equal line 6A1 minus 6B1, and then the same for, and that's for the beginning of the year, and then the same to make sure that the end of year calculation also works out, that the net assets is calculated correctly when compared to the total plan assets and the total plan liabilities. So the next thing is in part 5 in the financial information. This is where you would enter the employer contributions, the participant contributions, and any other contributions that have made it to the plan. This might include things like rollovers. And the next field that we're going to talk about in the plan characteristics section is the pension code table, or the type pension benefit code. And so this is where you list all of the plan characteristics. This is required. So J509EZ will fire if no pension codes are entered. And then if there are certain pension benefit codes that are entered that are invalid for the 5500 EZ, P217EZ will fire. And the list of codes that aren't valid are specified here. And then there's more information about this in the form instructions. So in the compliance and funding sections, this is where you would answer questions about if there were any participant loans, and if so, what the amount was. And so there are two related edits to this. There's the X088EZ, which says that you have to answer whether or not there were loans, and then the X-089EZ that says if you answered yes, you have to tell us. You have to tell. You have to include the amount of those loans. And then there's the question 10, which is related to the defined benefit funding requirements. And if the plan does have one, then you need to report if there's an unpaid minimum contribution for the current year. And this is something that would come from the SB. And then there's some additional questions here on the minimum funding requirements here on 11. And then these are the actual data elements. And then the related edit is X116EZ, which says that unless the pension benefit code contains 1X, line 11 is for defined contribution plans to answer. And now I'm going to transition to Bill, who's going to walk through some of the signature edits as well as the updates to entity edits.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. As you mentioned, I will be continuing on with the rest of the data elements on the 5500EZ. So the next section is dealing with the signature requirements. So these are similar to what we have on the other form versions. We have a signature date and the manual signature date and the employer typed name or employer typed signature for the manual process. Both of those are very similar. Moving on to the next, sort of one of the big changes for the 55EZ is the attachments that are acceptable. We have only 2 attachments that are valid for the 5500EZ series. So for the variables, you can see that there is the attachment ID, and that is the same as it has been, an unsigned integer up to 999. And then the attachment type codes, which are valid, is a new type, the EZ attachment type. And that is for the e-signature alternative and reasonable cause late attachment. Continuing on with the signature name and date, there are a couple of new edits related to the e-signature option for service providers. These are very similar to what we have for the current 5500 and 5500 short form. So 123, X123EZ is for filings that have been signed using the e-signature option for service providers. However, the required attachment for the e-signature is not attached. X125EZ is also for e-signature option for service providers. However, the signed name and or signature date is not provided. X126 is for also e-signature providing service providers, and the credentials have not been provided. 128EZ fails when the employer signature date is present and the plan year end date, the manual sign date is less than the plan year end date, or it's greater than the submission date. So both of those are considered errors within the system. We have some new edit tests. I101EZ is a warning that your filing may be late if the EZ is received after the due date or extended due date. So you just need to check your 5500 EZ line B if an extension was filed, and check the dates that are applicable, provide or attach an attachment for the reasonable cause for filing late, as we discussed previously. The other new edit is P215EZ, which is a warning edit for line 3A. A final report or return is checked. However, you have not met the criteria. So again, just check your checkboxes and make sure that they are set correctly and consistently. Some more new edit tests. X002 Sorry, and I should say these are all related to the filing header. So these are checking for consistency between the filing header and other parts of the filing. X002 is checking for the employer sign name and signature date does not match in the filing header, does not match those elements on the 5500 EZ. X008 EZ is checking the plan year, begin date, plan year, end date, EIN, plan number, or amended indicator do not match those data elements on the 5500 EZ. X48 and X118, these are the EZ versions of the similar edits that we have for the 5500 and 5500 short form. So these are checking for consistency between the plan year and the plan year begin date in the filing header. X119EZ is for forms where the prior year indicator has been checked, however, you're submitting on an incorrect form year. And then the next section we're going to move into is the entity validation edits, Jeff alluded to a little bit earlier. And for just 1 second, I apologize if you're on the video, I'm going to skip to slide 77 and give a little bit of an overview of the 2 different types of edit checks. So there are, as you can see in the processing flow, when we're checking entity validation, we do some general, also global entity checks, and then we do some cross-year validation. So beginning with the 2020 form version, the 5500 EZ is new, so we will be enabling those global entity validation checks. However, we will not be enabling the cross-year filings because we do not have the electronic versions of those forms in the EFAST2 system for the cross-year editing. So that will be enabled starting on with the 2021 form year next year. So I'm going to jump back to my original slide. Sorry. So the first series of entity edits, Z001, is a warning that the information on the plan filing has matched one that has already been submitted, and it may therefore be a duplicate submission. So this is one that will be enabled this year because we're checking for filings in the current year to make sure that you have not accidentally submitted a duplicate filing. Couple of edit changes here, just to add the form 55EZ to the edit. The next entity edit is Z002 and Z003. As you can see from the acknowledgement error message, these are looking at fields on the current submission and matching it to last year's return report. So those are what we would consider cross-year entity checks. These are not in place now, but they will be in the next form year. But these are looking for the plan name or plan number do not match consistently across those years. The next grouping is Z004 and Z005 related to the plan sponsor zip and plan feature codes. We've modified those to check for 5500 EZ. Just note at the bottom, Z006 is related to the plan funding and benefit arrangement codes. It does not apply to the short form or the EZ form. And the DIR, the data element requirements, was updated to remove the XPath relative to the short form data mode node for Z006. The next set is related to Z007 and Z008. This is for beginning of year assets and participant count. So we are checking those values against the previously submitted version and looking for consistency issues between those fields. Z009 is the sort of what I call the roll-up for the fields and checking that they have been entered consistently. So in this one, we're looking at all those fields and making sure that none of them were matching one that was submitted last year, and that's going to be Z009 edit. The other two, the next two edits, Z010 and Z011, are related to address verification. So we're checking the two addresses, the plan sponsor's address and the plan administrator's address. So these are not cross-year edits, so these will be active on this current form year. Those are warning edits. So the address, if it's just a warning that they might want to consider updating that. Z012 is related to the filing having the same EIN and plan number has already been submitted, so we may consider that this is a filing that needs to be an amended return or report. So we're checking to make sure that's not an error or an omission on the submission. So we just want to have you check that. The next edit Z013 is also checking for consistency for an initial filing. So the data on the submission leads us to believe that this may actually be an initial filing, and you just need to check the data. If it's not, then you can refer to the comments below and take appropriate action. So just as I mentioned, just to recap, so there's some edits, the ones that are generally referring to the checking versus the prior year, that will not be active until the 2021 form version, and the rest of the entities that are checking only against the current form year version will be enabled this year. A couple of other things added this year or changed this year is the 2 bypass edits. So bypass S has been activated for or updated to allow it to be used on 5500 EZ. So this is just checking for a planned year ending date minus the planned year beginning date is less than 1 full year, accounting for leap year if necessary. And then also bypass T has been edited to allow it to be set for 55 EZ. So we added the XML mapping and comments to indicate that that is allowable, as you can see below. Some other changes that have been made to the 2020 form version. DIR variable 10 has been updated to allow the new value of 2020 V01.00. The XML namespace has been updated to support the 2020 XSD and WSDL namespaces. The namespace for prior years does not change. However, as Aaron mentioned previously, we are now only supporting 2 active form years. So as you can see in the list below, the 2020 and 2019 versions are active. So in August, during the patch release, we will remove all of the other versions. And then on January 1st, 2021, when the 2020 form version goes live, this will also take place in the production environment. All of those other form years will be inactivated. The other annual maintenance consideration is, as I kind of touched on briefly, the sort of swapping edits that happen every year. One set gets masked and one set gets active, and then they change later in the year. So the X118 and 118 short form has been updated this year to account for early 2021 filers on a 2020 form. As you can see, we're just incrementing the years in the edit. And then, as always, the new edits will be masked, and then the previous ones will be unmasked. And these will also, as we talked about earlier, be taken into account for the EZ form next year. Since they're new this year, they're not getting updated per se, but they will be into this loop of updating and masking and unmasking starting next year. The other change this year, we talked about this last year at the conference, if you were in attendance, is that we are updating the request ID format. This is dir variable 945, and this is to allow a wider range and expanded character set within the request ID, which has been a cause of some errors in the past. So in the 2019 form version, it's still required to be globally unique 20 character message identifier, which is generally the transmitter ID plus 12 alphanumeric characters. You can see the regex pattern for that there. On the 2020 and later form versions, we are expanding that to 36 characters and updating the regex rule set to allow both the previous version, the 20 character alphanumeric, and to support a 36 character UUID format. So you can see an example of a UUID. It's several groups of characters separated by hyphens. Either one of those will be allowed and supported in the 2020 form versions at some point. they may be reduced. We'll see about usage, but for now, they will both be supporting both of those so that your systems can transition as needed. Some other changes, we created a new EZ schema definition, that's the XSD file, and then we incorporated the EZ XSD into the filing XSD. Jeff talked about earlier that there were some fields that were reused, and so we tried to, as much as possible, reuse types. So one of those was that we moved the sponsor type form, which was only used in the short form, over to the EFAST types, which is a higher level global schema definition, because it was used now both in the 5500 short form and the 5500 EZ. We also updated the documentation and error text for the plan name type to include a % sign, which is just an additional character that we were seeing needed to be added. So moving on away from the EZ and annual maintenance changes, just a couple of notes. We usually have a section where we talk about ways to improve submissions. Just touching on this briefly, we want to make sure that everyone is validating. We have a validation service that you can use, or making sure that you're validating it within your system as much as possible. The goal of that is to help reduce schema errors. We have, like I said, we have the pre-validate filing. We also have the get signature validation and validate attachment services, which will allow third-party vendors to be able to, check their filings before actually submitting it and reduce the amount of errors. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to reduce the error test errors, looking for missing or inconsistent data, calculation errors, or things related to filer choices. So when someone's filling out the form, there are things that they may do, such as not attaching the appropriate attachment or not filing it on time. We realize there's not a lot that can be done about that, but the goal is to try to reduce those. We actually have made a lot of headway in the last year. All of the those 3 helper services have had significantly increased usage. The pre-validate filing is more than doubled, and the validate attachments and signature validation have had several percentage point increase in usage, and that has led to between 30 and 70% reduction in overall error rates. So that is a win. Moving on, the last slide, we just want to remind everyone that if there is any additional information that you need or questions that you have specifically related to anything in this presentation, getting set up for the next form year, any development questions, you can certainly reach out to us at the EFAST2 Contact Center by email, which has changed, but we do still support the other one for a little while, and or phone at the Contact Center. You can get additional information, such as documentation, by logging into the EFAST2 web portal. And so with that, I think we will conclude the presentation. We just want to take a minute and thank all of those in attendance, Marianne from DOL, Yagu from the IRS, and the entire GDIT team. We thank you for your attendance today.